All right, you guys, happy Wednesday. For years, we've heard from attorneys, we've read court filings, we've seen the motions, but today we're finally hearing from the Chancellor himself. The contrast between Jersey College's public philosophy and the legal position in my case, I think are interesting at the least. February of 2026, Greg Karzhevsky shifted his approach to participate in a 30-minute feature on a higher ed leaders podcast. During this episode, he presented a highly curated narrative detailing his philosophy on mission driven leadership and addressing the national nursing shortage. Greg Karzhevsky, the owner and chancellor of Jersey College, did something I personally have never seen him or observed him do before, which is sit down for a podcast about Jersey College's mission and philosophy, something I've never seen in the past 23 years of Jersey College being open. So, what caught my attention wasn't that he was promoting the school, but that's expected, right? It was hearing themes like student support, changing lives, helping underserved communities, and getting students across the finish line, while at the same time, the reality that I'm living through litigation, where the institution has taken a very different posture in my observation that I've seen in my own case. I'm not going to unpack all of it today because I think we could go on and on, but I am going to highlight a couple crucial points that I picked up on. I do want to compare the public mission being presented with the legal positions that have been taken in court and really raise a question and ask, do those two narratives fit together? On one hand, Greg talks about food insecurity, housing insecurity, underserved communities, and changing the trajectory of an entire family's future. On the other hand, the appellate brief, from my observation, argues that pursuing nursing school was voluntary, discretionary even, and not a fundamental necessity. Both statements exist. My question isn't which one is true, but how they fit and cast. Greg states something to the effect of they have positions for helping students with everything from food insecurity to housing insecurity to family and domestic issues, for examples. I think the messaging being communicated is students' economic and personal realities affect whether they can successfully become nurses. So, Jersey College intentionally builds support around those realities. That's my observation. But also, in my observation, there is the litigation position that I'm currently dealing with. In the first appellate brief, Jersey College argues, quote, the enrollment agreement concerns Price's voluntary pursuit of a higher education, not a fundamental necessity, end quote. I want you to hear me when I say this. What they are saying is the enrollment agreement does not involve fundamental necessities like food, utilities, or housing. It involves a voluntary higher education program. They also go on to say, quote, when a contract involves a discretionary purchase, the degree of economic compulsion is not a determining factor, end quote. They also go on to say, and I quote, when a contract involves a discretionary purchase, the degree of an economic compulsion is not a determining factor. Here, the enrollment agreement involved a discretionary choice to pursue secondary education, and no other economic factors constrained price, end quote. They go on to say there is no question that this was Price's election to pursue a post-secondary nursing degree. But I want you to listen carefully to what's being acknowledged here. So, Jersey College is saying that becoming a nurse essentially doesn't happen in a vacuum. Students may be dealing with food insecurity, housing insecurity, financial hardship, or domestic problems, and those realities can affect whether they reach the finish line. Now let's go back. The enrollment agreement does not involve fundamental necessities like food, utilities, or housing. It involves a voluntary higher education program. To be clear, in my observation, Jersey College is making this argument as part of its position that the arbitration agreement was not procedurally unconscionable. They are arguing that nursing school is legally different from obtaining food, housing, or utilities. So the question I have is, but where is this public messaging in the courtroom? Because that framing is fascinatingly different to me. In the podcast, food insecurity, housing insecurity, and financial instability are important enough to require dedicated student support. But in the brief, nursing education is characterized as a discretionary choice that does not involve those fundamental necessities. Then I ask, can nursing education even be separated cleanly from food, housing, and financial security the resulting career is supposed to provide? I think Greg's podcast repeatedly describes nursing education as transformational. It changes families, it addresses work shortages, it serves underserved communities, it creates opportunity. But in the brief, in a section that I summarize, it analyzes through the lens of only contract law. So, was the enrollment agreement necessary? Was the enrollment agreement voluntary? Was there economic compulsion? Was this a fundamental necessity for purposes of procedural unconscionability? I don't think those are mutually exclusive ideas, but they do frame the significance of nursing education differently. Also, let me leave you with this. Can something be legally voluntary and still be so economically life-changing at the same time? If so, should courts, schools? Further on, Greg goes on to talk about helping the underserved communities become nurses. Now, from my perception and understanding, I don't hear him describing students with endless options. I hear him describing students whose options are already limited. And don't take it just from me. I'll link it down below so you can draw your own conclusion. I think he says something to the effect of, quote, many of our students are coming from communities that have been underserved, end quote. I think the public messaging is Jersey College exists to expand access for students from underserved communities, adult learners even, students with financial barriers, students who may not fit the traditional path, creating opportunities where opportunities were limited. I go over this in episode 27, where Jersey College that I went to was placed and the history behind that I find interesting. So to me, the overall message is we're here because many students don't have the same opportunities other people do. But then I go back to my own reality, the litigation part, the litigation argument. In the opening brief, Jersey College argues there was no economic compulsion because pursuing nursing education was voluntary. Price was under no obligation to attend Jersey College, and she could have chosen another path or institution. The appellate brief repeatedly frames my situation as someone who simply failed out, declined remediation, and later demanded a diploma she didn't even earn. She's basically bitter from my observation. That's how I interpret it and understand their brief ultimately. So I think it poses a fair question. If Jersey College's mission is to expand opportunities for students whose opportunities are already limited, how should that context be considered when discussing whether attending the school was simply a discretionary choice? I, again, discussed this more in episode 27. I would take a look. My analysis and observations on where these schools can be strategically placed. And does the philosophy that I'm hearing now on the podcast versus the litigation I'm living with in reality match? Greg also goes on to talk about we're solving the nursing shortage. He says something to the effect of, quote, he saw firsthand how hard it was to find nurses, end quote. I think that's interesting because the entire argument of mine has never been, let me practice without a license. It's always been, allow me access to the state licensing process. I think that's a subtle but important distinction to be made. And how can we argue? I saw firsthand how hard it was to find nurses. So why are we making it harder? If you saw firsthand how hard it is to find nurses, why are you making that process harder than it needs to be? Greg goes on to say something to the effect of, quote, everything is built around the Board of Nursing, end quote. This one really jumped out at me, of course, because he says, quote, we have to have our program approved by the Board of Nursing, end quote. Quote, everything has to prepare students to become licensed, end quote. I think exactly that. That's why I wanted to reach the board's licensing exam, because they should be in control at the end of the day. And from my understanding, they ultimately are. I think that's clean. I think that's a clean thought. I really do, because all I want to do is get to the Board of Nursing to sit for my NCLEX. If I've already done everything they require of me, there's no reason I cannot sit for my NCLEX. And if you think your claim is the exit exam proves some sort of competency or right away to the NCLEX, I have an issue with that, because where does the Board of Nursing say that's true? They actually say the opposite, and they're troubled by the use of exit exams preventing otherwise qualified nursing students for sitting for their NCLEX. The NCLEX is the ultimate test to prove that competency. So how can you predict what it's going to prove? Just let me take it. Let the NCLEX be the judge of the competency. Greg goes on to say, quote, we meet students where they're at, end quote. This is probably one that got me to pause. He says they support students based on life circumstances, adult learning, psychosocial needs, financial needs. And then later, quote, he says, quote, we're going to put them on our shoulders, end quote. I personally think, observing this from a third party perspective, that that's an incredibly powerful marketing statement, but that's just me. So now my question becomes, at what point does carrying the student stop? What point do you let go and let God? You can't, it kind of feels like a custody battle, which I've talked about in the past. Like the Board of Nursing is mom saying, let her come with us. And then we have Jersey College, who is dad, and saying, no, she's staying with me. And then we have the judge in the middle, like, well, she has her bags packed. She's old enough to decide. She's smart enough to decide. Just let her go. Let her go see her mom for once. Like, see what happens. See if she likes it. See how it goes. And that's like, no. She needs to stay here because of XYZ. Where is your proof that mom is so bad that she's going to fail when she gets over there? Something bad is going to happen. Where is the evidence for that? Further, Greg continues saying, quote, students aren't just a number, end quote. And I think this practically writes itself, because as we know from our research that these exit exams have been implemented to block otherwise qualified nursing students from taking their NCLEX to pad and protect a school's accreditation, and by inflating those NCLEX pass rates by only letting those students with the highest probability takes those exams. almost ensures most students are going to pass, so it doesn't affect the accreditation. So what do you mean I'm not just a number? Please explain that to me. I think I'll just let that sit with you. He continues, quote, we're going to help them cross the finish line, end quote. I think he literally says, we're going to help them cross the finish line, like verbatim. What exactly was the finish line? Your finish line or the Board of Nursing's finish line? Because I don't like your finish line. When I dedicate years of my life to this, preparing for this, making life changes to complete this, when I show up every day for everything and I complete everything the board requires me to and pay around $30,000 and invest time in my life I can't get back for what? For you? Because you don't lose anything. You keep the reputation. You have the lawyers, you keep the accreditation, you keep the money. What happens to students like me? What do we get? A redo? A redo out of everything we've already completed and passed? More time and money invested? Does that sound logical? And we can't even sit for our NCLEX. So which finish line did you create for us? He goes on, quote, this changes families forever, end quote. He says, quote, the trajectory of their family life is altered, end quote. I think this has to do with career, income, supporting children. I think this is him acknowledging what a big decision this is versus in the briefs where it minimizes my own experience. So when we're talking to the public at large, I see a reoccurring theme. He's saying everything I've been saying, almost. Like we almost agree here. But then when it comes to the filings in court, the legal framework, things are different. Vastly different, if you ask me. Again, let's get back to the food insecurity, the housing insecurity. I think it's another fascinating contrast. He specifically says Jersey College supports students facing food insecurity, housing insecurity, and domestic issues. Yet again, litigation has often narrowed that discussion I've been trying to make, just to dumb them down to legal doctrines rather than the broader life impacts. So I ask, if those hardships matter enough to build support systems to be used as maybe a marketing tool even, while somebody is enrolled, why wouldn't the consequences of completing or not completing the program matter when evaluating this dispute? Riddle me that. This was probably my favorite quote of his, and I'll never forget it. I may make a t-shirt, I'm not sure. Quote, scar tissue, end quote. He goes on to say, quote, a lot of the measures we put in place come from the scar tissue, end quote. I feel like at the very best Greg could do at his capacity of empathy and sympathy, he sat with me for a moment, just for a brief moment. I think this is a surprisingly vulnerable statement from Jersey College's chancellor himself. I believe he's essentially saying that difficult experiences shaped how Jersey College operates. That quote really made me stop for a second because I'm thinking, what is scar tissue? Am I scar tissue? Is that all I am to somebody? Scar tissue? Because that's what forms after a wound heals. Was I the wound? They go on, they become healed, and I just disappear? Changes how you move, it changes how you think, and sometimes how you protect yourself. Every institution, I think, has scar tissue, but that also means every student can have scar tissue too. My YouTube channel has been about documenting what I would call my own scar tissue, not just from nursing school itself, but everything that happened afterward and that will gravely affect my life. So, if institutions can learn from their scar tissue, how should they think about the scar tissue students carry away from the experience they had gave them? He goes on to say that, quote, look in the mirror, end quote. Greg talks about leadership looking inward rather than blaming others. But again, versus the reality in my litigation, all the brief seems to do is solely blame me. I love this quote, again, because I think it applies to everyone. Students should look in the mirror at what schools they choose, who they trust, what they believe, what they know to be true. Schools should look in the mirror. Attorneys should look in the mirror. Boards should look in the mirror. Business owners should look in the mirror. Investors should look in the mirror. I've had to look in the mirror. I think that's what we should all do. I love this. He talks about, so Greg continues and he talks about critical thinking. I think it's kind of funny because he says, quote, our instructors cannot teach students everything, end quote. Quote, students have to develop critical thinking, end quote. Challenge accepted. I'd like to insert here a photo of me studying because he goes on to say something to the effect of, remember when you have big textbooks and you had to highlight something to memorize it, and then like when you're taking a test, you had to think about that corner you highlighted in, which paragraph and section it was in, instead of, basically having all of this technology. And I thought, did he just give me a compliment without giving me a compliment? Thank you. So yes, I can critical think, and maybe we're more alike than you actually know, because I have proof I did that. I think that's funny. Ultimately, when it comes to critical thinking, though, critical thinking isn't agreeing with me. Critical thinking isn't agreeing with Jersey College. Critical thinking is comparing evidence. Critical thinking is looking at all the evidence together. The podcast, the catalog, the legal briefs, the transcripts, the student experience, and how many of those students were affected, and those internal communications that ultimately affected all of this. So let's think critically together. What do you see when you look at this investigation? Where does it lead you? Greg starts to end with growing in purpose. He makes the quote, we've never grown simply for growth, end quote. I think that's an interesting philosophy because Jersey College has grown significantly over the years. When educational institutions grow, I wonder, what does that look like? Why do some institutions grow faster than others? Should growth be measured by campuses, enrollment, graduation, NCLEX success, student satisfaction, accessibility, long-term outcomes, how much tuition and financial aid you can get from one or two or three or more? He ends with, treat everyone like family, more or less. And this is the emotional ending I was expecting. Quote, treat everyone like family, end quote. What does that actually mean? Families celebrate together. They celebrate the wins. Families disagree, families forgive, families argue, families sit together in times of despair and loss or failure. Families have uncomfortable conversations to make it better. Families sometimes disappoint each other. Families sometimes repair relationships. Every institution gets to define what that phrase means, and I think every student probably defines it differently as well. When conflict happens, what does treating somebody like family actually look like? Because if you treat everyone like family and this is how you treat your family, it raises a red flag for me. I think that's a much deeper discussion. I think there's an overarching theme here. What Greg is doing in the podcast is describing aspirational values, how he wants the institution to see itself, maybe how he wants the world to see it. What court briefs do in advanced legal arguments. Are they written to persuade a court on legal issues? Yes. I think those are different purposes. I think the most interesting contribution isn't to say one is right and the other is wrong. I think it's maybe to ask, how does an institution's stated values and its legal positions relate to one another when conflict arises? How are those values reflected or not reflected in the way that the institution responds? Is there friction? Is there tension? All right, guys, some questions and comments from this week. If you had 1 hour with Greg Karzhevsky, what's the first question you'd ask? Well, going back to this podcast specifically, because there would be a lot to say, and it's probably not what you're thinking, but ultimately, as far as this podcast, he also says something like, I sleep well at night because I know we're fulfilling our mission. So if I sat across from Greg, not as a plaintiff, maybe as a student, but just as a human being, not as a case number, maybe as a mother, maybe as a woman, but just that, nothing more, not the layers, just the woman that I am, who completed the curriculum and still never reached the finish line. Would he still tell me he sleeps well at night? And if so, what would he say happened to me? What does he think should happen to me? What do I mean to him? Am I just another number? Am I scar tissue? The fact that he reaped benefits off of my hard work and free labor and tuition, and I got nothing but this out of it. Years of delayed progress, years of delayed career ventures, years of decreased pay when I could have been making more, years of experience that was taken from me, years of battling to be independent and not worry about the next paycheck and things like that. Does he think about things like that when he sits in his beautiful life and what he's built on the backs of people like me? How do you sleep at night? What makes you okay with that? How do you justify it? How do you see it? How do you look at it? How do you not feel bad? What if I was your daughter? Would you want her to be treated like that? Would you allow her to fail? Would you call her a failure? I've linked the full podcast in my description. AVRN says, I failed my ATI exit exam 4 times. It was literally the only reason I couldn't graduate after passing all of my courses. And guess what? She passed the NCLEX recently on her first try. Congratulations. A student whose identity I will be protecting says, again, thank you so much for all you've done. My classmates and I are constantly sending your content back and forth. You are how we found our high stakes testing was coming to an end. So happy for you. You guys deserve it. Nursing school is hard enough. The world is hard enough, and we're all just trying to make it through. We don't need unnecessary battles. Another student who identity I will keep private as well. Hello, I'm currently attending Jersey College in Ewing, New Jersey. I say, how's it going, with a heart. She says, it's okay. We're all talking about what you're doing to change the way things are going here. So I will see you guys next week. Things are going to start getting interesting. I don't know if you guys like law, mystery, legal things, but I love to break it down because the reality of, PR and legal themes and the actual realities, I think, can be different. I think every institution has a public relations strategy. Every institution has a legal strategy, and then there's the reality. PR is designed, I think, to earn your trust. The legal strategy is designed to protect the institution's interests in court. But neither one by itself, I don't think, necessarily tells the whole story. Somewhere between those two is where people like me actually live. That's where the students succeed or struggle and sometimes fall through the cracks like me. I think PR tells you who an institution wants to be. The legal strategy tells you what an institution is willing to argue to protect itself by any means necessary, and maybe what actually happened. Somewhere in the middle is the truth, and that's, again, where students like me live. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm not asking you to believe Jersey College, but I'm asking you to compare all three: the public messaging, the legal arguments, and the lived experiences. Because if you're only listening to one of those voices, you're probably not hearing the whole story. So I'll leave you with that. And until next week, protect yourself, educate yourself, and try to be at peace. Bye, guys.